All right, today we're jumping into a really incredible piece of historical detective work, all inspired by the scholarship of Mishra. We are going to tackle a massive what if that connects two events on opposite sides of the planet in a way you've probably never even considered. So let's get right to it. What if the American colonists had lost? I mean, really think about it. What if George Washington's army had been defeated and those 13 colonies just stayed British? It's a question that forces us to look at the history we think we know in a completely different light. But here's the twist. The most shocking answer to that question isn't found in North America at all. Nope. To really get what a failed American Revolution would mean, we have to look 8,000 miles to the east, to India. Because it turns out the American War for Independence had a massive, devastating echo on the Indian subcontinent. And look, this isn't just us making stuff up. We're using a serious historical tool here called counterfactual history. The whole idea is to make one tiny change to the past, what historians call a minimal rewrite, and then trace out all the plausible ripple effects. It's a powerful way to see just how critical a single moment in time can be. Okay, so to understand what could have happened, we've got to first get a clear picture of what actually did happen. Because the loss of its American colonies sent this massive shockwave through the British Empire, forcing it to make a dramatic and, as it turns out, very fateful change in direction. So when Britain lost America, it created this absolute perfect storm. All of a sudden, they were facing three huge problems at once. One, a massive financial hole. Two, a highly trained professional army with absolutely nowhere to fight. And three, a seriously wounded national pride. They needed a win, and they needed it fast. Let's just talk about the money for a second. By the end of the war, Britain's national debt had exploded to £250 million. I mean, that is an almost unimaginable amount of money for the time. This wasn't just a political embarrassment, it was a full-blown financial catastrophe. So where do you look to plug a hole that big? Well, the lost income from America was somewhere around £3 to £4 million a year. And then you look at India, and you see that just one province, Bengal, could generate about £3 million a year in tax revenue, all by itself. For the British government, the math was simple and ruthless. India was going to pay for America's freedom. And you can see that same pivot when you look at the military. You've got thousands of professional soldiers who are no longer fighting in America. Well, they didn't just pack up and go home. They got redeployed. And the numbers here tell the whole story. Troop levels in India just surged, sent there to make sure Britain's new prized possession could be locked down and milked for everything it was worth. Okay, so now let's dive into our counterfactual. Here's our minimal rewrite. Imagine Britain wins a huge, decisive victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. That victory prevents France from ever joining the war on the American side. And without that French support, the American rebellion just fizzles out. America stays a part of the British Empire. Now, in this alternate timeline, Britain's money, its armies, and all its political focus would have been tied up in America for decades to come, and that would have given the powerful, independent states of 18th century India the one thing they needed more than anything else, just a little breathing room. And what could have grown in that space is just stunning to think about. You had the Kingdom of Mysore, right? A hotbed of military innovation under Tipu Sultan. In our timeline, it was crushed, but it could have easily survived to become a major tech power. Or the massive Maratha Confederacy. Instead of being systematically torn apart, it might have pulled together into a stable, powerful state. And the Sikh Empire up north? It could have survived its leadership crisis to become the dominant force there. These weren't just fantasies. These were totally plausible futures. You know, these political changes would have also spun off a completely different economic future for India. It's really a story of what was stolen and what could have been built instead. So this all comes down to a concept historians call the drain of wealth. See, in our timeline, Britain didn't just rule India, it systematically siphoned its wealth. The way it worked was kind of crazy. They used Indian taxes to buy Indian goods for export, which means India was literally paying for its own stuff to be taken away. It created this relentless one-way pipeline of wealth flowing from India straight to Britain. And the result of that drain was an economic catastrophe. I mean, just look at these numbers. In 1750, before the British really took over, India produced almost a quarter of the entire world's industrial output, mostly textiles. By 1900, after a century of British rule, that number had collapsed to less than 2%. That's not an accident. That was the result of a deliberate policy of deindustrialization. This side really lays out the two paths. On the one hand, the historical path, wealth extraction, deindustrialization. On the other, the counterfactual path. An India made up of independent states could have kept its own capital. It could have invested in its own factories, its own technology, and used protective tariffs to grow local industries. Exactly like Japan did a few decades later. So why does any of this matter, right? Why should we spend our time imagining a past that never even happened? Well, because exploring that other path tells us something really profound about the world we actually live in today. What it really shows us is that history isn't inevitable. It's not some straight line marching towards a predestined conclusion. It's actually a series of incredibly fragile moments, these turning points. A single battle won instead of lost, a single decision made differently, can send out ripples that completely change the fate of millions of people thousands of miles away. So let's just quickly recap the main takeaways here. First, the American Revolution wasn't just an American story. It was the direct trigger for Britain's aggressive all-out conquest of India. Second, without that trigger, powerful Indian states had a very real, very plausible shot at surviving and modernizing on their own terms. And third, and this is so important, India's economic collapse wasn't inevitable. It was the direct result of colonial policy. And that leaves us with one last, mind-bending question to think about. The success or failure of a revolution in America could have completely changed the destiny of India, creating a world we can barely recognize. So what other single moments, what other turning points in our past have created futures that we can't even begin to imagine?